banshee's call shall wake the dead. When dark portents wax nigh, heed them as the counsel of a seer, or a father of the Yngir, who have slept since the birth of chaos shall crawl once more from their tombs, thirsting for warmth. The war in heaven shall be as nothing to their vengeance, for the sons of Assyrian, few in number, cannot stand against them, and the eye of Isha shall dim. Closing for eternity, such a gentle goddess cannot witness such atrocities as they shall wreak. The soulless one shall be the harbingers of the dark fate, then shall come the living dead. The progeny, them the thirsting ones, the forever damned, and the galaxy shall run red as the blood of Eldenesh. The foul moon shall bring forth the dragon, the master of death will drink deep from Isha's eye. That which lies outside will be drawn to the harvest, and the jackal god shall turn brother against brother. The four shall take their place amongst the stars, their legions ascendant, unstoppable as the night. A deadly shroud shall fall across the spirit, and the galaxy shall mourn.
Hail, curious adjutants. My designation is Asmogan, a humble orator of lore and hobby for those with the willingness to listen. Before I begin this first of hopefully many future in-depth lore entries, I must note to you all an important bit of information. This series you are about to embark on is not meant to be a wholesale replacement or substitution to the novels and codexes of the 40k mythos produced by Games Workshop and its team of writers known as the Black Library. If you seek the best and purest form of Warhammer 40k lore, there is no greater source than the original. This series aims to give a complex and intricate explanation for the universe and its events. However, some elements are my own interpretations as aspects of events are left vague or ambiguous for flexibility by Black Library. Unlike some others, however, I do not take this aspect of the universe's writing to make the leap of logic and sense to claim there is no such thing as canon within Warhammer 40,000. This would be absurd and disingenuous to state. All stories, myths, and legends have foundations in their writings that never yield to change nor the molestation of current or future sensibilities and ideologies. A baseline from which none can ever deviate, for it would then become an entirely unrelated and unrecognizable tale. This is what canon is in any given story. Without it, there is no such thing as a setting, and there is no such thing as lore. Canon and lore are mutually dependent and intertwined. One cannot exist without the other in any notable form or fashion. Warhammer 40,000 is no exception to the rule. Though its lore is soft and malleable at places, that modular element is not in the entirety of a given aspect of the universe or events, but merely in the interpretation of said events, typically in more specific elements. We do not question nor debate whether things like orcs and tyranids exist in the universe, for they have been definitively established in the lore and reinforced over many a novel, codex, and tabletop miniature. Thus, they are canon in Warhammer 40,000. We do not question nor debate whether events such as the Horus Heresy or the Siege of Terra occurred, as the stories that lie within these events serve as avenues in which the lore and setting are established, each tale further reinforcing and solidifying said events as having occurred, thus establishing them as canon. Now that I have established this baseline understanding, let us now take our first steps into the universe of Warhammer 40,000, at its earliest point, that being the tale of the Necrontyr, the Old Ones, the Catan, and the War in Heaven.
Existentialism is possibly the most onerous imposition of life. They need to ask why, to find some explanation. Nevertheless, despite the perfections granted me, I remain a living man and so must suffer under the cacophony of questions in my brain. And so I send out this final message to attempt to answer some of the questions you will have. Why did I lead my fellows to their doom here on this arid plateau? Why have I submitted myself to the power of the immortal creatures who have risen from its sands? How could I, a respected scientist and prominent citizen, turn my back on the civilization that has given me so much? The answer is simple. I have done everything in the name of purity. Before my memories and emotions were reassembled in this more perfect form some 15 cycles ago, I had spent a human lifetime studying civilizations in all its forms. The sum of my work could be put thus. All life exists in discord. War and strife affect all known societies, and all species spend their existences competing with others for limited resources. From the cries of an infant for the maternal teat to the wretched stench of the aged dying in their own filth. Life is a series of squabbles and ugly messes.
Long before the Imperium of Man was founded, the human race made its first steps upon primordial Earth, and before the Eldar first made headway into the galactic void, there was a race of beings known as the Necrontyr. The Necrontyr were a humanoid race of beings born to horrific circumstances in the far reaches of what would come to be the known galaxy of the modern 40k setting. Their race existed beneath a scourging blight of a star, from which inconceivable amounts of radiation poured down upon them and their world. This radiation was so strong that there was no natural way for them to adapt to it. Thus their bodies would be drowned in radiation from the moment of their birth until their death, which for many would not be long after said birth, all the while living lives of cancerous lesions and gaunt physicality. The Necrontyr were surrounded on all sides, day in and day out, by death. The lucky ones were considered those infants who never drew breath, for they would not come to know the struggles of merely taking in and releasing oxygen from their tumor-laden lungs on such a desolate, hellish waste as the Necrontyr's homeworld. Despite these nigh insurmountable circumstances of their burgeoning race, the Necrontyr still persevered, fighting and clawing forward in a day-to-day desperate gambit to establish some modicum of an existence less fleeting than a gust of wind in the annals of galactic history. After some time, the Necrontyr developed society and infrastructure for their species and constructed many cities on their blighted world. However, due to their race's horrendously short lifespan and immensely high mortality rate, the Necrontyr began to worship the concept of death. This fatalist worship affected how the Necrontyr cities were structured, as they were designed from the ground up with the imminent deaths of its occupants in mind. The dead were better facilitated than the living, as they were viewed as brief guests. The Necrontyr revered their dead ancestors and fulfilled what roles they could in life to best earn some level of respect after they went and joined them. Nothing was made or built in honor of the living, as none would live long enough to see it. Truly, their existence was a pitiable one. Despite this melancholic existence, there was a spark of determination in Necrontyr, a drive to cease living in such a dour place and thrive, to not just survive, but also to truly live. Thus, the Necrontyr passed an ever-lit torch from brief generation to brief generation. This torch was the hope of the stars, to shed off their damned homeworld and tarry forth into the unknown void for places where they might find some semblance of lasting life. Eventually they succeeded. The Necrontyr developed massive, slow-moving stasis crypts, which would allow them to maintain their ever-evaporating life forces and successfully find purchase upon new, unirradiated soil. With this success, the Necrontyr began developing an empire as they colonized numerous worlds and made them their own, building up their glory and at long last crafting monuments to something living, the dynasties. Though being off of their home planet aided the Necrontyr in sustaining their lives for slightly longer periods, they still found themselves terrified by their brief mortality. Though death had been pushed a modicum further away, he still always came for them far too soon. His cold hands ever encroached upon them. They had not defeated death, only forestalled it. Thus the Necrontyr's drive for escaping their homeworld turned into a ravenous thirst for immortality.
We are born for a darker purpose than that of mere existence. There will come a time when Stygian night never ends, where dead stars will spread before us like islands that slumber on the ocean, and when the beings that hid like shadows will feed on us forever.
Whilst conquering numerous worlds throughout the ancient galaxy, the Necrontyr eventually encountered an unspeakably ancient race known simply as the Old Ones. These ancients were a reptilian species who wielded unspeakably powerful technologies, using energies the Necrontyr could barely comprehend, let alone wield. The divide between them is clear, and so the Necrontyr attempted to open relations with them in the hopes of learning more. In a sense, this worked. The Old Ones gladly spoke with the Triarch, the Necrontyr's ruling council of 3 dynasty monarchs known as pharaons. The leader of the Triarch was known as the Silent King. The Triarch and the Silent King are hereditary positions that had governed Necrontyr society ever since it had been formed back on their homeworld. The name, the Silent King, comes from the Necrontyr's desire for some modicum of consistency in a society so fraught with loss. Instead of having a king with a name and face publicly known, they would have a ruler of title, one whose individual identity would not be known, and when they would be replaced with the next in their line of their kin, there would be no public ceremony and no acknowledgement of the succession. The Silent King and his Triarch would be an eternal comfort for a very fleeting society. When the representatives of the Old Ones convened with the Triarch, or possibly proxies of them, the Necrontyr's leaders would likely have been shocked to find the Old Ones so open about themselves and their people. The Necrontyr learned from the Old Ones that not only were they responsible for seeding much of the galaxy with life as a self-imposed duty as galactic caretakers, but that the Old Ones themselves had come to conquer their mortality. They had advanced to a stage where they had achieved immortality. Not invulnerability, but dominion over illness, aging, and the frailties of the mind. The Triarch could never have believed such luck had befallen them in these moments. The dream of defeating death and conquering their weak, frail bodies, mortality was seemingly within their grasp. No doubt with desperate and juvenile impatience, the Necrontyr pleaded with the Old Ones to teach them, or perhaps bless their people with the same immortality, finally lifting them far and above their ancient melancholy. However, this moment of serenity, this opening of the gates to Nirvana was slammed shut before them by the Old Ones. The ancient reptiles outright denied the Necrontyr's plea. The Old Ones, as it seemed, had a code of conduct and behavior when it came to their self-imposed position as composers and caretakers of life in the galaxy. A prime directive, if you will. This code stated that they were not allowed to share their advanced technology with other species, cultivated by them or otherwise. Though cold and brutal, the Old Ones were honest and direct with the Necrontyr on this front. As it was clear it was a non-negotiable point of contention, the Necrontyr ended their parley with the Old Ones. This interaction broke the Triarch and by extension the Necrontyr as a whole. To be offered a cure to their greatest plague, to be taunted with salvation right in front of their very eyes, only to have it sadistically snatched away, was too much for the Necrontyr to bear. Additionally, as the Necrontyr Empire bloated in size, several dynasties sought to take hold of their own destiny, separate from the rest of the Necrontyr Empire, and attempted to secede. This could not be allowed. Thus the Triarch attempted to keep the discontented dynasties obedient. However, this was a daunting task, and numerous wars of independence began to rage. The Necrontyr were fractured and needed a unifying cause, a common goal, or a common enemy. Thus, only one course of action felt appropriate to the gaunt race. War. The Necrontyr declared war on the Old Ones.
Order, unity, obedience. We taught the galaxy these things long ago, and we will do so again.
The Triarch, immediately after declaring war upon the Old Ones, offered amnesty to the separatist dynasties, likely encouraging them with great verbose speeches of the Necrontyr people and denigrating anecdotes of the Old Ones whom they were then to face together. As allies once more, these separatists, sharing all Necrontyr's animosity for the Old Ones' selfishness and the possibility of acquiring their knowledge of immortality, happily put aside their differences in the face of such prospects. Thus, with little pretense, the first War of the Heavens came to be. It is not documented the exact length of the war, nor what losses were incurred on either side. However, it is commonly accepted that despite having weapons that could face off with the Old Ones, the Necrontyr constantly found themselves outmaneuvered by the reptiles. The Old Ones created and expertly utilized a series of galactic tunnels through interdimensional rifts which the galaxy would later come to know as the Webway. The Webway allowed the Old Ones to traverse the stars and galactic theater with ease, leaving the Necrontyr appearing eerily still by comparison. Regardless, the war was waged and the Necrontyr gave it their all. but they could never hope to win. Not alone. Though neither side was wiped out, it effectively came to an end after the Necrontyr's already fragile unity became fractured by a lack of victories and eternal strife, and they were pushed back to the Halo Stars, their home system. The varying dynasties which gladly banded together to crush an arrogant foe, as well as acquire their knowledge of eternal life, by force, fell apart once it became clear neither goal was achievable. One could even be forgiven for interpreting such context clues as the Old Ones not even engaging in combat against the Necrontyr during the First War of the Heavens, ignoring them like a minor annoyance unworthy of dedicated attention. There is no way for me to confirm this interpretation with empirical evidence from the Texas Black Library as far as I have found. However, I would choose to be bold enough to present my own supposition as the correct interpretation in this case. I mainly cite the Old Ones' tactics later when faced with the Necrons and Catan as the foundation of my belief. I believe that the First War in Heaven was one of attrition for the Old Ones, a one-sided conflict where they chose not to destroy a lesser race given their self-assigned duty as galactic caretakers. I believe it'd be in the Old Ones' nature to simply avoid the Necrontyr where possible, though still engaging them in just enough battle to push them back. After all, later we see the approach they chose when a genuine threat presented itself. Creating entire species just to act as their weapons and defeat their enemies is very telling of me, of a people who knew little on how to wage war on a personal level, but instead preferred scientific and technological solutions to problems. At the very least, one that prefers a peaceable solution rather than an overwhelming show of force. Regardless of your interpretation of the broad idea of the First War in Heaven, the war came to an end after the Necrontyr were herded back to their native system. It is there the Old Ones considered them defeated and carried on with their work elsewhere.
We are less than cattle to these beings, chattel to be cast aside, consumed or made sport with for their pleasure. There is not one amongst them that would pay heed to a world of man as I would to an ant on my boot.
Having been pushed back to their homeworld and system, the Necrontyr were officially considered defeated. Though they were not wiped out, nor were they crippled given later achievements, so it is safe to say the Old Ones let them be at the end of the war. Fractured and tearing at the seams, Necrontyr society began to face civil war yet again, as the major dynasties began declaring independence once more. The Silent King and the Triarch had lost all they had gained at the start of the war, and in miserable fashion, soon the Necrontyr, as they knew themselves, would be no more. Merely a divided hodgepodge of dynasties spread haphazardly across their irradiated homeworld, and its equally horrific neighboring worlds, only ever unifying under the pretense of an outside force affecting them as a species. The Triarch no doubt had begun to lose hope, both in themselves and the Necrontyr people as a whole. After everything they had done at the back of their unified efforts, the very same people who had escaped the horror of their homeworld together were now all too happy to tear away from their brothers and sisters and allow what little galactic strength they had mustered to fall to the wayside over petty squabbles and political power grabs. At this same time, the Necrontyr continued to develop their technology and research. Fueled by lingering hatred of the Old Ones, they sought to invent or discover some means in which to tangibly harm the reptilian menace. It is amongst these intellectual sojourns that a discovery was made, that of a looming presence in the void. The method in which the Necrontyr discovered this presence in the void of stars is not definitively known. Again, going back to my original point about canon in relation to Warhammer 40k lore. It is soft, but still the given canon elements are concrete as any. In this case, we know definitively that the Necrontyr came across and encountered the beings in space known as the Catan. What is soft or malleable is in the finer details of how, and sadly again, there are those in the community that would take that soft, finer detail and claim the entirety of a given canon does not exist in the lore. This comes from a place of grand misunderstanding and woeful, belligerent arrogance. Especially those that continue to claim this in spite of clear and present concrete information that has been so since its detailed establishment. Diverting course back to the subject at hand, there are numerous interpretations and sources from which we can draw to answer the question as to how the Necrontyr discovered the star gods, which later would be christened the Catan.
However, the one I will present is the one I believe most likely to be correct, as I always shall. In this case, that being the Necrontyr, given their horrific living conditions, would have obsessively researched the stars and astrology in hopes of discovering a way to combat the negative effects of their star. Therefore, after the first war in heaven, they continued to dedicate to this research and send out probes to other systems and stars in an attempt to compare and contrast differing conditions to their own. Amidst this research, a long-range probe, while studying a star's fluctuating energies, would have noted a powerful drain on its radiation levels. The probe would return to the Necrontyr's homeworld armed with this discovery, and their astrologists and researchers would have combed through the treasure trove of recorded data. After enough study and analyzing said data, they came to discover a presence of source, actively draining the sample star of its energy, feeding off of it, effectively speaking. Realizing this presence must have some form of intelligence due to its behavior towards the probe and its motions after the fact. The learned scholars presented their findings to the Triarch. Armed with the knowledge of an ancient imposing sentient force, the Silent King offered up the interpretation of these entities to be the progeny of their death god. Said progeny were called the Catan, or Star Gods, in the Necrontyr language. Whether the Silent King believed this or not is not known. What he did believe, however, is this force could be used against their bitter enemy, the Old Ones. Through means unknown, the Necrontyr opened communication with these beings. However, it was clear the Catan were unable to maintain any fluid perception of the materium. Therefore, communication was extremely inefficient given their ethereal forms. Thus, the Silent King put his best minds to the task of giving the Catan the ability to manifest themselves into our realm. They would be constructed bodies. The Necrontyr engineers and scientists decided to create these bodies using the same material their intergalactic voidcraft were made out of, a substance known as necrodermis, or living metal, as it translated to mean. Necrodermis is an otherworldly material made of both unknown chemical or molecular structures, though it is noted for its ability to regenerate any and all damage nigh instantaneously. The perfect shell for the Catan's would-be bodies. After presumably some trial and error, the completed necrodermis bodies were offered up to the Catan to inhabit. Though it took some adjustment time, the Catan became content with their new forms, and even quite fascinated by a corporeal existence. A chosen representative of the newly material Catan came before the Silent King to begin discussions anew. This particular Catan was known by its fellows as the Deceiver, a title all of Necrontyr would come to know for all time and into damnation. Alas, perfect premonition was not a power of the Necrontyr possessed. Whatever name or designation the Deceiver chose to go by to the Silent King and the Triarch is lost to time, so I will continue to refer to him as the Deceiver, even though the Necrontyr did not know this name. The Deceiver presented the Necrontyr and the Triarch with a tale of war, long fought between themselves and the Old Ones. A hard-fought conflict that had ended with the Catan's loss. But then he placated to the Silent King that with each other's support, they could both defeat their mutual enemy and benefit. An offer not only of alliance, but an offer to also grant the wish for immortality the Necrontyr so readily craved. The Deceiver even insisted that there would be no cost for said immortality, insisting it was only an offer of benevolence. The Silent King thanked the Deceiver for his offer and asked for some time so he could seek counsel from his advisors and fellow members of the Triarch. For months, the Silent King debated the offer with his council. Out of the whole of them, there was but one voice opposed to the Catan's offer, the court astrologer, Orican. Orican believed the offer seemed too good to be true, and though they may gain power, it would come at the cost of the Necrontyr's souls. However, if the Silent King were to deny the offer from such obviously powerful beings, would his people receive such an offer for salvation again? Could they find another way? The Silent King made his decision. Shortly thereafter, the Deceiver met with the Silent King once more and affirmed their pact. The Catan then presented their plan to make the Necrontyr immortal, through a process called biotransference. Essentially, the Catan pitched to the Necrontyr that they would repeat a similar process unto which the Catan themselves had to gain access to the corporeal realm by placing the consciousness of the Necrontyr people into necrodermis mechanical bodies
not unlike their own, replacing their weak and decaying flesh with the hardy permanence of metal. The Necrontyr agreed to the plan, and the Catan had the Necrontyr build up the biofurnaces facilities that would be processed through to achieve this promise. Soon, every dynasty had every citizen of the Necrontyr as well as themselves collected and placed on the proverbial assembly line to receive their immortality. Though I have no doubt in my mind that the Catan were inexperienced enough not to showcase any of their deception, I like to think that they held firm smiles whilst watching the Necrontyr herd themselves into these processing stations, knowing all too well what was really about to happen. What exactly transpired inside the biofurnaces cannot be known. The Necrontyr themselves do not recall in detail. However, I would surmise that the Necrontyr would enter inside, and through ethereal energies, their flesh would be filleted off whilst their souls were sucked out and dispensed above to be fed to the Catan. What remained inside would be little more than bare consciousness, with little sense of self, as the soul had been taken, and that consciousness would be placed inside a necrodermis body to animate it. The process was swift and efficient. Before they could truly process all that was happening, everyone's living Necrontyr had been turned into what we know as the Necrons. Metallic, Terminator-like automatons with no regard for themselves and an eerie, unflinching resolve that could not be stopped by killing them only once. Without their souls, the vast majority of the Necrons were entirely robotic. They possessed no emotion, value of self, value of others, and a basic hard coding to obey. The Silent King Cesaric, however, was cursed to still possess a sense of self when he exited the biofurnaces. He was still wholly in himself, inside his eternal metal prison, and he looked around in horror at what he had done. He saw the hollowed eyes of his companions, advisors, underlings, and more stare back at him, as if to say, "Look at what you have done to us." The sheer horror of it hollowed his metal heart. He had single-handedly doomed his entire race with one single decision. The Necrontyr were no more.
Death stands above me, whispering low. I know not what in my ear. Of his strange language all I know. There is only pain and fear.
The Catan, having kept their end of the Freudian bargain, instructed the Silent King to keep his and his people's. They were to aid one another in a massive-scale war against the Old Ones, and despite the clear deception by omission performed by the Catan, the Necrons wanted the Old Ones dead just as they had before. Thus, the Second War in Heaven began, with the Necrons scorching across the void and engaging the Old Ones, now aided by the Catan and more advanced technology. Now, before we go too much further, it is important to explain that the Catan left the leaders of the Necrons with their wills and consciousness intact because they wanted them to act as generals of the massive amount of Necron warriors and still be able to think critically and creatively whilst doing so, allowing them to remain effective leaders in battle. Additionally, the majority of Necrons that were without souls and sense of self were programmed, essentially, to follow the Silent King's orders to the letter. You may be wondering at my mentioning of this, why didn't the Catan simply make all the Necrons mindless automatons? Well, we don't know the exact reasoning. One could argue it was some sick sense of honor in their deal made with the Silent King, and that if they had made them all truly subservient, mindless robots, it would have made them breakers of their word, given the other party was no longer able to participate in the deal. You could also argue it was hubris, and the Catan did not fear the Necrons lashing out at them in rage for what they had done and would fall in line all the same. Regardless, in the end, they programmed the Necrons to serve the Silent King as their base protocol. The Catan and Necrons waged the war they had agreed to, and they did so with fantastic results. The Old Ones were losing engagement after engagement, battle after battle. In many ways, it was a wholesale slaughter of their kind. The Catan would conjure black holes, blot out suns, erupt entire planets in flame. All the while, the Necrons would engage in more direct combat with the Old Ones and give them no quarter.
In response to the combined threat of the Catan and the Necrons, the Old Ones quickly seeded several species into the galaxy, the Eldari and the Kroks chiefly among them. Both species were designed to be the ultimate soldiers against the Necrons and their Catan masters. However, their growths were not fast enough. The Necrons in Catan hunted the Old Ones to every corner of the known galaxy and exterminated them. Any allies and lesser races which aided the Old Ones had their souls fed to the Catan to continue fueling their horrid existences. Though we do not know how long the war went on, in its final years the Necrons discovered how to access and use the Old Ones' webway to travel across the stars at even more blinding speeds. With this discovery, the Necrons began using the webway against the Old Ones. Their greatest strength became their greatest vulnerability. As you might imagine, the Old Ones didn't stand a chance. By the end, they were all annihilated, punctuating a firm victory for the Necrons and their Catan masters. Luckily for the Eldari and the Kroks, they were not killed alongside their Old One creators, and began growing to the point to face the Catan and the Necrons. However, much would happen before they would get the opportunity. After the war was seemingly over, the Catan began feuding amongst one another, from small-scale arguments to full-blown warfare. The reason for this growing disunion amongst the Catan was their competition over souls and life force of the mortals they wished to feed upon. Effectively, they were feuding over food. Given the Catan were star gods, a bickering feud between them, including the blotting out of suns and planets being laid to waste. Eventually, the Catan began going so far as to consume each other for their others' souls. This divine form of cannibalism eventually resulted in only a handful of Catan remaining after a few centuries. The Catan, through this series of savage actions, ended up opening themselves to a vulnerability they had completely disregarded in their hubris. With so few of them left and their food source becoming more feuded over, they were now weak. Weak enough to be overpowered by the new races wrought by the Old Ones' dying breaths. The Eldari and Kroks, and a large number of other species bred by the Old Ones to fight the Catan and Necrons, came forth into the galactic scene and slammed against the Catan and their growing empire. With crippling efficiency, the progeny races of the Old Ones much avenged themselves upon the Catan and Necrons, pushing them back once more to the Necrons' home system. With the Catan few in number, weak from fighting and now cut off from fresh souls on which to feed, they met one final great defeat at the hands of the very beings they had granted immortality. The Silent King throughout the war had been biding his time for when the Catan would be vulnerable enough to defeat, and after the Old Ones had also been annihilated. And the Catan had foolishly weakened themselves to such a pitiful degree. The Silent King had the Necrons pounce. The Catan were no match at this point, given their lack of numbers, their powers drained and the Necrons themselves offering no source of food as their souls had already been consumed by the Catan themselves tens of millennia prior. The Necrons unleashed unimaginably powerful weapons they had been building in secret right underneath the Catan's notice and subdued the star gods in one foul swoop. You'll notice I use the term subdued and not killed. This was an important distinction on my part, as the star gods were still very much that. Though they were indeed weaker than they had been, they were still no easier to truly destroy. The Silent King knew this well before his betrayal of them, and it was not his goal to let them off so easily as to grant them the kindness of death. No. The Necrons instead sundered the Catan in many broken shards of what they were whole and stored away. Not unlike a genie in a bottle. However, the Necrons did not achieve this unscathed. Millions died in the process of their rebellion, including all the former members of the Triarch, the Silent King excluded, of course. As the Necrons had suffered major losses themselves, both due to their rebellion and the full-blown onslaught wrought by the Old One's progeny, the Necrons knew they were not in a position in which to reconquer the galaxy once more, and take what they believed to be their rightful place on the proverbial throne of the galaxy. Thus, the Silent King accepted their time, for the foreseeable future, was over, and put forth his people to be put to rest, in a form of hibernation, until the time would come for them to retake the galaxy from the other intelligent races. After all, they had achieved their longest-standing wish of immortality. There was no reason to rush. what was rightfully theirs would be so in due course. After all, who knew better than they the cruel effects of time on mortals? The Eldar, Krork, and all the rest were fickle leaves upon the tree of life, and as with all things, one day they would wilt and fall. Thank you so much for watching, everyone. I hope you enjoyed this first long-form entry into the 40k universe, and are looking forward to more in the future. Make sure to subscribe so you can stay apprised of all the latest uploads, and leave a like to let me know you enjoyed it. I also always love to hear from you amazing people, so feel free to drop a comment below letting me know what you thought. Anyway, that's it for me, guys, and remember,
The Emperor protects.